Hi, my name is Dalia Yan, and this is my Flatiron School Phase 5 project using Ruby on Rails for my backend, JavaScript, React, and Redux for my front end. Before talking about the code and the code flow, I will be showing you my application and how it works. So this is my application. It's called Piggy Banks. In it, you have our home page where we have a list of all the piggy banks. We have the form to be able to make our own piggy banks and assign it different values. I also have an about page about my application, saying simply that it was created on Ruby on Rails, JavaScript, React, and Redux. Just some information about how to use my application. And then I have another link. A little bit biography about myself. This idea for this project came to life when I was watching Squid Games on Netflix. I saw the piggy bank increasing in value, and I thought, hey, maybe I can make my own piggy bank and give it its own values and names and genders. So that was how I came to create this application. I was inspired by the show. And then we'll go back to the home screen. Here we have a list of different pigs, and we have the ability to make our own. So let's make a coding piggy for this is a boy, and he has $186, which we see rendered right here, coding Poggy with their monetary value. We can create a deleted piggy that is a girl, and their value was added right here. Let's also make another one. There we go. The pig is added to our bank. So now I'm going to show you how I was able to create this application. First, I will just show you how I entered my application. Opened up the folder. Okay, so here's my application. Before I even started dealing with my front end, I created what I needed to in my back end to be able to create a database for myself. So I created my model for my bank that just validates that there's a name, that its uniqueness is true, that it's even inputted. I also created my route just to allow myself to have access to the index of the banks, specific bank indexes, etc. I created my migration so that every bank value would have its name, gender, and fund saved into my database and stored in the back end. I created my seed data, just some dummy data, so that every time I cleared my database that I'd have some data rendered. So I just have a couple of generic names, their genders, and some funds for every pig that I created. And I created my controller. Similar to my JavaScript project, I'm rendering JSON so that I can display the bank values. While I have the index of all of the banks, I also have the ability to create banks, and if they are not created correctly, the ability to display their errors. I also have the ability to delete a bank as I want to, and then just some params that are necessary for a bank to be created. It's generally the things I did in my back end. Something that I had to do in my initializer course file was to uncomment lines 8 through 16 to get my application to work. I also had to, in my gem file, comment back in line 26 to use rack cores to to be able to access that database in the back end. And I believe that is all I really had to do to get the back end of my application working. So I will bring you into the front end. So I chose to create my application in one folder where I have a backend folder specifically for my backend and a front end specifically for my front end. For me personally, it's easier to have everything in one place. I know some people do not want their information stored, so they only share their backend and not their front end. I personally just prefer to have it all in one place when I code. So I went into my index and I had to import, later in my application I incorporated Redux, so I had to import, create store, and apply middleware for Redux so that I'm able to store my data in the front end using Redux. On line 11, my variable make a bank function where I'm creating a store. This is again happening behind the scenes using Redux. And I incorporate my bank's reducer, which I have in my reducer file, which I'll talk more about what that does. And then to that reducer, I'm applying the middleware thunk to be able to access that data and manipulate it from solely the front end. And on line 15, for my provider, which every index JavaScript for React has, I'm storing that variable make a bank function into that provider so that I have access to it throughout my application. So this is what my index file does. I did have to import some specific files that weren't included in React, such as like Redux and then React Redux, middleware to incorporate Redux, and thunk. So that were things that I had to seek out on my own to make sure my website, my application met the requirements. Right here I have my app JavaScript file, which is just like home to everything. A lot of my containers are connected to different components, so my app just renders in my index JavaScript file right here. So my app hosts my header, my nav bar with the different links I provided. It also hosts the about page and the biography page, which is right here. My about page is just a stateless component that hosts the different knowledge about my application, just some simple text in a p head. So that is what my about JavaScript does. Again, it's a stateless component because it doesn't change, it just portrays some HTML in the front end. And again, I have my biography, which does the same thing. Stateless component just shows some text into my website. My header just says Piggy Bank, which you can see right here. It doesn't change, there's nothing to do to alter it. It just exists as a stateless component. I also have my nav bar right here, which are the links to the different about pages and biography. Those that the components in my nav bar do not change, they're stateless components, and they exist in my app folder. As we see here on lines 30 and 31, I have my bank container and my form container. So if we open up right here, my bank container is home to my bank list, which is just the rendered data of all of my banks created. I'll open that up and we'll kind of work backwards from here. So that's what my bank container that is held in my app does. It just holds my bank list. So we'll look at my bank list, and it incorporates or it imports the fetch banks function from my actions fetch banks. So we'll just look at that. Here's fetch banks, although it does more than just fetch banks. And here we see the function fetch banks. It returns dispatch, which returns the local host, the link of all the banks in my database. And then there's the then method, which takes that as a JSON. It takes that response as a JSON, and then from line 9, we dispatch the load banks constant, which was defined on line 1. And we dispatch that action to my reducer. So here on line 1, we have load banks that takes in banks, and then it loads the property of got banks with the banks right here. Let me show you what that is referring to. It's referring to my banks reducer. So I have my state, which is just banks with an empty array, because the state holds all of the list of banks that I have, and it also returns that action. So here I have a switch statement, and then it takes the action type. So here for my got banks, that returns just the state and then the list of banks in my database. And then on line 5, I have add banks, which allows me to add banks to my database. Line 8 is not incorporated into my project because I was only required to load and create banks using Redux, but when I'm ready to, I can incorporate delete banks so that I can delete my banks using Redux, is what my reducers do. So we see here, that's where load banks is coming from for my fetch banks in my bank list. So that's what that does. It allows me to have the ability to fetch the banks from my backend using my reducers, using my actions. Here I'm creating the state, which is bank data, which is just an empty array. On lines 11, I have my fetch bank data method that takes in the argument of bank data. And then I'm setting the state of this to equal, or to return actually, the state of all of my banks and my bank data. So what this does is it allows me to have the list of all of my banks in my front end. So here, all of the banks that are created in the back end are rendered into my front end and stored in Redux using this method. This gives me the ability to delete banks from that list, which I'll show you disappeared. You see I deleted it from the back end, and if we were to look in my Rails console right here, we can see that it's been deleted. Where the ID is 39, it's done, and then it returned back to the index page. I did this using JavaScript, but I can incorporate Redux as needed. Right here, I take the list, so the whole list of all of the banks in my database, I take them all and then I map them individually. So every bank from number 1 to number 40 has a name, has a gender, has a bank fund. And with every bank, I'm also giving it the ability to delete itself singularly. So that's what my map banks method does. It allows me to take that whole list of banks, break it down so that they're individual, and gives me the ability to delete each one individually. What my components did mount method does is that it just maps the allows me to render on the first request for the front end for the user side. So that's what component did mount do. And then I have a render method that just takes this, which is the object, and applies the maps bank method to it, so that for this all of the back end piggy banks that are being stored are now mapped so that they are individual piggy banks with their individual delete methods and their singular lines. And now we have the star of the show, map state to props and match dispatch to props. So what state to props does is that it allows me to have props of my bank data from the back end. So it takes that information out of my back and it gives me the value of the state. So the state can also be used as a prop in the different containers that it's rendered in. For me, that's in my bank list, and in my bank form, the ability to create a new bank. So that's what my map state to props allows me to do. What map dispatch to props allows me to do is it allows me to update and change the global state. So it allows me to change the amount of banks stored in the back end. It allows me to delete banks from the storage in the front end, actually, because I'm using Redux to store in my front end. That's what it allows me to do. So on line 79, when I export both state and props, I'm using the connect method, which I called on line 2, which is something that React Redux allows me to have. And I'm connecting both map state to props and match dispatch to props when I'm exporting my bank list to the bank container, which is rendered in my app. That is how my bank list works. It's like intertwined with a whole bunch of other code I have going on. So from that, we are able to see the list of banks, which is great. I'm able to delete banks, which is also great. Something else that my application has is the ability to create my own piggy bank, so I will show you how to navigate through that. Let me open up some files. So I have my fetch bank open because it applies to my bank form and my ability to create new ones. I also have my bank form container. Excuse me. Something I used in my app that I didn't really talk about as of right now is my app CSS, which just allows me to style my app. I became really knowledgeable through my JavaScript project about how to use this and class names to customize my page, and I wanted to customize this application. It's my final one for the Flatiron, so I used styling to, create this. And something I didn't talk about were some of the images you see in my application were just imported from the internet. I have my money, I have my pigs, my squid game. I was able to render them using, here, I'll show you how I was able to render them. So I import the file from their home. I'll talk about this in a moment because everything I have is all tied together. So as we see in my app JavaScript file, I also have my bank form container being rendered into my application. So we'll look at my bank form container, we look at it, it doesn't do much, it just exists, and it's a home for my bank form. It's just like a container that hosts my bank form information, so we don't really need to access that anymore. And here is my bank form. So I'm importing React, I'm importing the ability to connect, I'm importing my fund card because that is how the money is rendered in my application, and I'm importing my action create bank for my fetch actions. So what I'll do now is I'll just look at my export constant create banks that takes in the form data, so everything that the user submits, it returns dispatch, and then you see plain old JavaScript of the post method to be able to create new data from the front end into the back end. I did this for my JavaScript project. I'm fetching the back end and I'm passing in this post method. I get back that response with a JSON method, and then from there I'm returning dispatch right here with my add banks, which I'll show you in a moment, with JSON taken in as a parameter. So my add banks does right here on line 2, and it takes in my bank as a perimeter, and then the type is to add banks, payload bank, which is familiar to you if you remember my reducer right here. It just returns the state of the bank, and then it returns the state of the bank and the action as payload. So you see right here I was able to get my banks, and right here I'm able to add them. So that's what's happening right here in my create bank, which was then exported into my bank form right here, or imported into my bank form. So right here I'm just setting the constructor method. I'm not setting equal to props because it's already stored in the state. I'm just setting the state as the name, the gender, and the fund. And I use the bind method to bind the object and the changes to the object to the state. Right here I have my handle method that takes in the event, and then I'm setting the state set equal to the name, the event, its targeted value, so whatever the user inputs. And I created 3 different methods because my name takes in an input that could just be any plain old text. My handle change is a drop down. Right here in my form you can see that to add the gender you choose either girl or boy from the drop down, and right here for my handle funds it allows me to increase the funds and add the funds so that you can increase your value to more than just 1 click of $1. And that's why I created them. Separately, the ability to handle the changes to the form. And right here, I have my handle submit that takes in the argument of an event. My event prevent default stops the application from submitting the data before it's ready to be submitted. On line 47, I create a constant called submit data. That is just set equal to the state. On line 48, this is what connects to my Redux, reducer, action. This props is having the create bank method called in it and taking the submitted data, which is the state, and setting that as the argument. If we remember right here, this is coming from this line 4. That action is being set, that method is being called onto the prop of the state, and its argument is that data that is coming in. So once you submit that data, it is submitted into the back end of my application, or actually the front end, the Redux storage, and then from there I'm just setting the state set equal to blank, so that way my page, once you submit your data, it returns back to an empty slate for the next person to input their own Piggy Bank data. Right here, it's a basic old form like I did in JavaScript. On my submit, on the form submission, I just have the method handle submit. As you see here, like the handle change is different for every aspect of the form because they work so differently. From this point on, I will just quickly jump into my fund card because that is something that I wanted to incorporate completely separate from what the bank form has going on. My fund card allows me to add money to my Piggy Bank, which we see right here, and add money and have it add to one another, because every dollar has its own unique value. So that's what my add money does. It sets this props and it calls the update bank fund method onto it. And it parses that integer because every value is a different number, and it just takes in that value that is being submitted into the piggy bank. Right here, I have the number value set equal in between h1 tags, which is what you see inside of the piggy bank. That's that number being added, the props increasing right here. From there, I just have different images from the dollars that I imported, and on every click you can increase the money value of the piggy bank, and I just assigned every dollar to their own value. So when you have your piggy bank here and you keep on clicking, this is the fund element of the pig. So when you create your pig and you also give it its gender, when you click on a dollar, you're giving it its fund value. And when you submit it, there's its fund value. So that is what my fund card does. It allows me to update the numerical value of the pig that you have. And then I just have my submit button to submit that data into my Redux store. Lastly, what I'll go over is at the top, I imported my connect and my create bank action for my fetch banks right here, the ability to create a bank. And at the bottom, I am not mapping state to props because it's already mapped in my bank list. I am, however, mapping dispatch to props, the created bank, to update the state of my piggy banks store. So I have right here create banks in curly brackets, property. And then I'm also exporting my bank form so that I have access to it elsewhere. And what that bank form does is that it lives in my bank form container, and my bank form container lives in my app. And that is how my application works. That's how everything is connected, using JavaScript, using React, using Redux to create a store and store that data. I hope you learned something new from this video. I also have in here just a checklist of requirements that my project is supposed to have. So I wrote in as much JavaScript ES6 as possible. I used the create app generator to start my project. I have, my application's all in one page. It's not different web pages that you have to use. I have my back end running right here. My front end is happening. 5 stateless components. I have more than 5. I have my header, I have my nav bar, I have my about page, my create page. I have a whole bunch of containers for my lists and my pigs that don't have anything going on. They just simply exist. Those things don't change. I have 3 routes, as we see here, my about page, my creator page, and my home page. I use proper RESTful routing in my application. I use Redux middleware to modify the state and change the data. I use asynchronous actions and Redux middleware to access my data and receive it from the server. I showed you that in my actions. I use Rails API to create my application. I created my app using the API command. I separated my backend with the data, and you can really see that in the different folders that I have here. There's not much. There's no data manipulation. What you see is what you get. Here you create your pig. It updates right here. If you delete your pig, it deletes from the list. And I have styling. As you see, if I didn't do anything, this page wouldn't be pink and you wouldn't see pigs everywhere. So that is my application. In this video description, I will be linking the GitHub to my project, a project application walkthrough as a user, so you can just see me use my project in action, and I will also link my blog if you want to follow me there or read more about my project creation. Thank you.